Prepare yourself for a journey through war and adventure. Follow Fitzroy Maclean as he takes you to the guerrilla battlefields of Yugoslavia. These are his words. Let's begin. From this point onwards, Serbia's relations with Austria-Hungary became increasingly strained. Serbia was clearly destined to become the rallying point for South Slav irredentism, and most of the South Slavs outside Serbia, those in Croatia, Slovenia, and Dalmatia, were subjects of the Austrian emperor. Thus, Vienna viewed the rise of Serb nationalism with growing concern. In 1908, the Austrians, leaving nothing to chance, formally annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina, Slav provinces that were still nominally part of Turkey, though since 1878 they had been administered by Austria-Hungary, much to the disgust of the Serbs. The Serbs were indignant but powerless to intervene. They too began seeking alliances. In 1912, along with the Greeks, Bulgarians, and Montenegrins, Serbia fought a victorious war against the Turks, forcing them to cede most of what remained of Turkey in Europe. Then, in 1913, Serbia fought the Bulgarians, their allies of the year before, for the spoils of their common victory, with the Turks joining Serbia's side. Serbia emerged from these struggles with her territories enlarged and her national consciousness thoroughly awakened. Austria's concern increased. She decided to settle the South Slav problem once and for all. An opportunity arose in June of the following year, 1914, when Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was assassinated while visiting the newly annexed provinces of Bosnia and Herzegovina by a young Bosnian Serb named Gavrilo Princip. The Austrian government maintained that the Serbian government had been involved in the assassination and delivered an ultimatum to Belgrade that Serbia could not possibly accept. The issue quickly escalated beyond Austro-Serbian tensions. Russia came to Serbia's aid, while Germany supported Austria. France and Great Britain were soon involved, and within a month, Europe was at war. The effects of the shot fired by Gavrilo Princip were far-reaching. During the 4 years of war, the Serbs fought bravely against overwhelming odds. With Prince Alexander Karađorđević, the great-grandson of the liberator, at their head, both the army and the civilian population performed remarkable feats of valor and endurance. They knew they were fighting for their very existence as a people and believed that victory would bring them unity with the Slav minorities in Austria-Hungary. Already during the war, deserters had crossed over to them from the Croat and Slovene troops in the Austrian army, and in 1918, a committee was set up to discuss the eventual establishment of a unified kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes under the rule of the Karađorđević dynasty. When the war ended, this was formally sanctioned at Versailles, and the name was later changed to Yugoslavia, the land of the South Slavs. In one respect, it is true, the peace settlement left Yugoslav aspirations unsatisfied. Under the peace treaty, Trieste was awarded to Italy, and a band of Italian nationalists, led by the poet D'Annunzio, seized the town of Fiume by force. Prince Alexander Karađorđević, King Peter's second son, who had led the Serbian forces to ultimate victory in the war, was proclaimed regent of the new state. King Peter was old and his eldest son, Prince George, had been persuaded to relinquish his rights to the throne after the suspicious death of his valet, an incident in which his younger brother maintained George had been involved. It was thought better for him to step aside. The dreams of the early Serb patriots had come true. After bitter struggles and great tribulation, their hereditary enemies, first the Turks and then the Austrians, had been overcome and driven out, and now, at last, a true South Slav kingdom was set up, ruled by a descendant of Karađorđe and uniting within its borders all their long-lost Slav brothers. All seemed to be for the best in the best of all possible worlds. But the South Slavs were not destined to live in peace for long. The Serbs, on the whole, had little to complain about. A Serb king was on the throne, Serb officers commanded the army, and the capital remained in Belgrade, a Serbian city. This, they felt, was as it should be. After all, victory had been won by a Serb army, not by their long-lost, newly found Slav brothers from across the border. Many Croats and Slovenes, they recalled, had not crossed over to them but had continued to fight for the Austrians as long as there were any Austrians left to fight for. Moreover, as it now appeared, they were different from the Serbs in many ways, in their outlook, their habits, and finally, in their religion. Thus, although the newcomers amounted to about 40% of the total population in the new state, the feeling among the Serb ruling class was that the Croats and Slovenes must earn their place before they could be admitted to full and equal partnership. This pan-Serb attitude was bitterly resented by the Croats, who were inclined to regard the Serbs as barbarian parvenus. They clung jealously to what they considered their national rights, which, some claimed, had been better safeguarded under the old, reactionary but at least civilized, Austrian Empire. Thus, scarcely had the longed-for union of all the South Slavs been achieved when Serbs and Croats were at each other's throats, in the best Balkan tradition. In the years following the establishment of the new kingdom, Yugoslav internal affairs were dominated by the Croat problem, which loomed even larger than the Irish question in British politics before 1914. Like the Irish question, it infused the country's political life with violence, religious rivalry, and fanaticism. The proceedings of the Skupština, or parliament, were constantly disrupted by increasingly violent clashes between Croat nationalists and their pan-Serb opponents. Finally, the situation reached a crisis in 1928 when Stepan Rodić, leader of the Croat Peasant Party, was shot dead by a political opponent during a Skupština debate. Reckoning that matters had gone too far for parliamentary government to remain viable, King Alexander, who had succeeded his father as king in 1921, abolished the constitution, dissolved the Skupština, and established what was effectively a personal dictatorship. Power was concentrated in the hands of the monarch, and authority was ruthlessly enforced by a large and ubiquitous police force, backed by the army. Little pretense of parliamentary democracy remained. The new regime was repressive and definitively confirmed Serb domination. On the other hand, it stood for the preservation of order and increased administrative efficiency. Alexander himself enjoyed a degree of personal popularity. A grim, determined, and conscientious man, he commanded the respect of his people through his wartime leadership, his capacity for hard work, and his undoubted devotion to what he saw as his duty. But like so many of his predecessors, Alexander was destined to meet a violent end. The abolition of parliamentary government had driven the more extreme Croat nationalists underground or into exile. In Italy and Hungary, the most violent among them, calling themselves the Ustaše, formed a terrorist organization dedicated to liberating Croatia from Serb domination, with Mussolini's protection, who saw them as a useful tool for advancing his own Balkan ambitions. The leader of the Ustaše was a lawyer from Zagreb named Ante Pavelić. From Italy and Hungary, the Ustaše sent clandestine emissaries back into Yugoslavia, but Alexander's police state was so firmly established that there was little they could accomplish. He himself lived in a closely guarded palace atop a hill outside Belgrade, surrounded by massive barracks housing the royal guards. The Ustaše bided their time. Their opportunity came in 1934 when Alexander paid a state visit to France. As the king was driving through the streets of Marseille with Monsieur Barthou, the French foreign minister, an Ustaše assassin shot them both before being killed by the police. I remembered the consternation this assassination had caused in Paris. Subsequent investigations revealed that Ante Pavelić had not been unconnected with the murder. His involvement was so close that, in his absence, he was condemned to death. In his absence, for Pavelić continued to live in Italy under Mussolini's protection, awaiting the opportunity to further his plans. Meanwhile, King Alexander's assassination did not result in any fundamental changes to the regime he had established. If anything, it became more oppressive under the rule of his cousin, Prince Paul, who assumed the regency during the minority of Alexander's son, Peter. In 1939, however, the outbreak of war in Europe, which could at any time spread to the Balkans, made it clear to Yugoslavia's rulers that they needed to make some effort to conciliate the Croats and unite the Yugoslav people in the face of the growing threat. An approach was made to Dr. Masić, leader of the Croat Peasant Party and a man of considerable influence in Croatia. As a result, Masić agreed to enter the government as vice premier. His party shifted from a policy of abstention and obstruction to one of limited cooperation, and the structure of the Yugoslav state was reorganized on a federal basis, improving Croatia's position. Hardly had these changes been agreed upon when disaster struck. In March 1941, the Yugoslav government was presented with what amounted to an ultimatum, demanding the incorporation of Yugoslavia into the Nazi New Order. For Yugoslavia to comply with this demand would have meant sacrificing her independence. On the other hand, refusal seemed to guarantee almost certain destruction. The men in charge, Prince Paul and Prime Minister Kvaković, decided to capitulate. Hastily departing for Vienna at Hitler's bidding, Kvaković returned a few days later having signed a comprehensive agreement with Germany. But they had miscalculated the will of the Yugoslav people. As soon as news of their deal with Hitler became public, a spontaneous popular uprising swept Kvakovic's government out of office and Prince Paul out of his elegant white palace, which he had built for himself on a hill outside Belgrade. A new government was formed under General Simović, and the 18-year-old King Peter was declared to have reached his majority. The pact with Germany was formally repudiated. The popular rejoicing provoked by these events did not last long. On April 6, German bombers launched devastating attacks on Belgrade and other Yugoslav cities. They were followed by the German army in force, with the Italians yapping at their heels. Against an enemy so overwhelmingly superior in training, numbers, and equipment, the Royal Yugoslav Army, poorly armed, supplied, and led, with no hope of Allied support, could do little. Furthermore, the army was further weakened by corruption and treachery. Cases of ammunition, when they reached the front, were found to be empty or filled with sand, and particularly among the Croat troops, there was large-scale desertion to the enemy. After only a few days, the Yugoslav government signed the capitulation. King Peter and General Simović's government fled abroad, and the Yugoslav army laid down its arms. It appeared that resistance had ended, and the Germans proceeded with the occupation and dismemberment of Yugoslavia. In Croatia, a new independent state was established on strict fascist lines. Ante Pavelić, arriving in the wake of the conquering Axis armies, was given the title of Poglavnik, or leader. The Ustaše flocked to his side to form his Praetorian Guard. Their long patience had finally been rewarded. In Serbia, now separated from Croatia and reduced to its former borders, the role of Quisling, or perhaps more fairly, Petar, was played by General Nedić, the former Chief of Staff. Yugoslav territory not included within the new borders of Serbia and Croatia was divided among neighboring states. Italy took most of Dalmatia and part of Slovenia, Hungary received the Bochka region, Bulgaria took part of Macedonia, and Germany annexed part of northern Slovenia. Axis forces remained in occupation of the entire country. Thus, once again, the South Slavs found themselves under foreign domination. But once again, their love of independence expressed itself in widespread guerrilla resistance to the invaders. The issue was inevitably clouded and confused by ethnic rivalries and internecine feuds. This time, however, there was a new complication, the ideological factor. Given their history, one might have expected the Yugoslavs to adopt fascism and communism with the same violent enthusiasm that they had once devoted to religious disputes. Indeed, they might even seek to improve upon the originals. We were bound for Bosnia. Had not the Bosnians, almost immediately after their conversion to Christianity, embraced Bogomilism, a particularly lively heresy that had caused endless irritation to the Pope? Had not these same Bosnians, after later being converted to Islam by the Turks, denounced the Sultan as a false Muslim and embarked on a holy war, a jihad, to reconquer the Ottoman Empire for the true faith? There was no telling what might happen to ideas in the Balkans. But two things in all of this encouraged me. First, the warlike qualities of the Yugoslav peoples and their tradition of resistance to foreign invaders, a golden thread running throughout their national history. Second, their love of independence, which had repeatedly extricated them from even the most tangled of situations. My mission was primarily military, and military virtue was my foremost concern. This, I felt certain, we would find. What else we would encounter remained to be seen. But one thing was sure, we would not be bored. Before I left, the Prime Minister gave me a copy of the directive he had issued concerning my appointment. What we want, he had written, is a daring ambassador leader to these hardy and hunted guerrillas. It would not, I thought, be an easy role to fill. But I was willing to try. On reaching Cairo, I immediately found my hands full with half a dozen urgent tasks. General Wilson, now Commander-in-Chief Middle East, who was very much alive to the importance of Yugoslavia as a subsidiary theater of war, and who had also taken a friendly interest in my activities since our first meeting in Baghdad, did everything he could to help with the preparations for our departure. My first priority was to assemble a strong team. Being only a very amateur soldier myself, I knew it was essential to have a first-rate professional soldier as my second-in-command. The name that immediately occurred to me was Vivian Street. Vivian had given up a grade I staff appointment at GHQ to join the SAS as a major and had the misfortune of being captured on his first operation. However, the submarine in which the Italians were taking him to Italy was depth-charged, and he was rescued by one of our destroyers in time to participate in the rest of the North African campaign. At the age of 29, he had earned a reputation as one of the best regimental officers and one of the finest young staff officers in the Middle East. He also possessed three qualities vital for my purposes: great personal courage and determination, a flexible and original mind, and an ability to get along with all kinds of people. However, I wasn't the only person aware of Vivian's value. When I informed General Wilson that I had chosen Vivian as my second-in-command, he said he would have preferred to let me take anyone else, as he had earmarked Vivian to command a battalion of his own regiment, the Rifle Brigade. Nonetheless, he eventually agreed to release him, likely feeling that Yugoslavia would benefit from a sprinkling of black buttons. Continuing this train of thought, Vivian and I selected another rifleman, John Henniker Major, who had entered the diplomatic service a year or two before the war, but like me, had managed to leave it and join the army. He had been shot through the chest while serving with the Rifle Brigade in the desert, but had fully recovered and was ready for any challenge. We believed his combination of military and diplomatic training would prove invaluable for our mission. In irregular warfare, success often depends on the skillful use of high explosives, so one of our most important requirements was a top-notch sapper as Chief Royal Engineer, CRE. Peter Moore, a regular soldier, walked straight into our arms. After distinguishing himself with a long stint in the desert, where he earned a well-deserved DSO and MC, he had been sent to Staff College and was now spending a few days' leave in Cairo, searching for something more active to do. His quest ended over a drink at Shepherd's Hotel, and soon he was scouring the Royal Engineers depots around Cairo for the latest infernal devices to take with us. He brought with him Donald Knight, a promising young sapper subaltern who had served with him in the desert. One of our most critical tasks was likely to be equipping and supplying the Partisans by air. This meant the position of Deputy Assistant Quartermaster General, DAQMG, which we had included in our establishment, needed to be filled by someone particularly capable. After a careful search, we found another sapper, Mike Parker, who in civilian life had been an electrical engineer. In the desert, he had divided his time between disarming the latest and trickiest German mines and serving as DAQMG for the 7th Armored Division. He sounded like the right man for the job, and we were right to think anyone good enough for the 7th Armored Division and General John Harding would be good enough for us. Next came the matter of intelligence. As soon as it became known among the intelligence experts at GHQ and the War Office that we were headed for Yugoslavia, we were inundated with requests to provide various departments with information about enemy order of battle. Since we would be living among the enemy, they assumed we would know everything there was to know about them. Somewhat hesitantly, we agreed that we probably should and set about finding an order of battle expert. This conjured images of bespectacled intellectuals who would be well suited to poring over captured documents at GHQ but ill-equipped for the life of Balkan brigands we envisioned. That was when I thought of David Sterling's intelligence officer, Gordon Alston, who had already appeared in these pages as a regular visitor to Benghazi during its occupation by the enemy. By the age of 25, Gordon had already lived a remarkably full life. He left Eton at 17 to become a racing motorist in Italy, later tried his hand at journalism in France and brewing beer in Germany. Since early in the war, he had served in commando or commando-type units. This varied experience left him with a taste for adventure, a knowledge of foreign languages, and, most convenient for us, a remarkable flair for military intelligence. He had the rare ability to piece together a coherent picture of the enemy's order of battle from a few captured pay books, hat badges, buttons, and a newspaper clipping. We signed him on immediately and sent him on a tour of GHQ to gather maps and other useful information. Another member of our original team was Robin Weatherly, who had a first-class record as a fighting soldier in the King's Dragoon Guards in the desert. As our only cavalry officer, we promised to put him in charge of the first horses, or armored vehicles, that we captured. Along with Duncan, who was promoted from corporal to sergeant for the occasion, Corporal Dixon of the Scots Guards, Corporal Kelly of the Seaforth Highlanders, and 2 specially trained wireless operators, this made up our party. At 32, I believe I was the oldest of them all. We left behind David Zotov, an extremely efficient young staff officer, and Sergeant Charlie Button, who would follow us later. Zotov was to act as our rear link with GHQ, while Button was tasked with collecting chocolate, bacon, marmalade, and other delicacies that we hoped might eventually be dropped in after us. A few days before our departure, we received the surprising news that we were no longer a British military mission, but had been transformed overnight into an Allied one with the addition of an American officer, Major Lynn Farish. I was pleased about this, as ever since my time working with American colleagues in Moscow, I had always had agreeable experiences with Anglo-American cooperation. Moreover, given that we were operating in a theater of war commanded by a Supreme Allied commander with an integrated Anglo-American staff, securing American involvement in this mission was undoubtedly advantageous. Our excitement grew even more when we met Major Farish, a large, rugged man with the look of a bear and an amiable grin. To our surprise, he was wearing the uniform of a major in the Royal Engineers. When we asked how that had come to be, He replied, "Well, when the war broke out in Europe, I figured I just had to get into it, so I joined the British Army, and I've never quite gotten around to leaving it since the States joined the war." Now, he explained, since he was joining this mission, he would have to switch over to the United States Army. The next day, he appeared resplendent in the uniform of a major in the United States Engineer Corps, though he still wore British parachute wings on his shoulder. "Call me Slim," he said, though the name seemed comically inappropriate for someone of his size. We asked Slim what he could do. He replied that he could build airfields, which prompted loud cheers. This, we told him, was exactly what we needed most. The sooner he could put an end to our current uncomfortable mode of entry into Yugoslavia, the one-way traffic in and out by parachute, the better. He promised to do his best, and we told him to make sure the airfield had a comfortable waiting room with a well-stocked bar. From that moment on, Slim Farish was one of us, and Anglo-American cooperation was as close as could be. This continued even a year later, after Slim himself had been killed, and the Americans decided to send in a full-scale American mission, at which point we reverted to our original British status. Our last days in Cairo were spent feverishly collecting information, weapons, equipment, sleeping bags, explosives, portable wireless transmitting and receiving sets, batteries, and charging engines. We also marked maps and drew up signal plans. Absolute secrecy was paramount, as Cairo was known to be full of enemy agents, and we had no desire to find the Germans waiting for us when we landed. Very few people, even at GHQ, knew our destination. For the most part, we maintained an elaborate pretense that we had no specific plans. I recalled the unpleasant reception we had faced from a forewarned enemy during our last visit to Benghazi and fervently hoped our security was better this time. At last, we were ready. There had been a lull in the fighting in Yugoslavia, and a signal arrived indicating that the situation was stable enough for the Partisans to provide a map reference for a safe drop zone, with minimal risk of encountering German forces. The designated spot was a secluded valley in the mountains of Bosnia. We were more than happy to leave the sweltering heat of Cairo behind as we made our way to the airfield in Tunisia, from which we would make our entry into Europe. We arrived at the airfield shortly before midnight. Our aircraft was still being loaded, and a beam of light shone across the field from its open door. It was a Halifax bomber, and as we approached, the enormous silhouette of its wings, engines, and fuselage loomed against the starlit sky. A Royal Air Force sergeant, reassuring in his manner, fitted our parachutes, adjusting the webbing straps across our shoulders and between our legs with precise movements. The station commander, who had come down to see us off, shook our hands, though his final words were lost in the roar of the engines. We climbed aboard, and the doors were shut. The wheels jolted across the uneven runway, and the roar of the engines grew louder and steadier. We felt the ground slip away from beneath us. We were airborne. Inside the aircraft, it was cold, dark, and stuffy, with barely any room to move. A faint light came from the crew's cabin up front. Every spare inch of space was filled with long cylindrical containers, which were to be dropped with us. We settled in as best we could and tried to sleep. I was woken by a hand on my shoulder. It was the dispatcher, a flight sergeant with a flowing mustache. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was. Then it came back to me. I glanced at my watch. It was 3:30. Getting close now, the dispatcher shouted in my ear over the roar of the engines. We ran into some flak as we crossed the coast. He crawled past us, carefully stepping through the containers, and opened the two halves of the trapdoor in the floor through which we would make our exit. The aircraft was rapidly losing altitude. We readjusted our parachute harnesses. But it wasn't our turn just yet, the containers had to go first. As they were rolled out, their static lines slapped against the sides of the hole with a noise like gunfire. By the time the last one was out, it was nearly 4 o'clock. The dispatcher motioned for us to come forward. Vivian and I scrambled to the trapdoor, attaching our static lines to the hooks inside the fuselage. I was to go first, and Vivian would follow. Slim Farish and Duncan would go after that. I sat on the edge of the hole, my legs dangling in the cold air. Glancing down, I saw faint points of light twinkling far below fire signals. Looking up again, I saw the red warning light was still on. The dispatcher raised his hand and slowly began to lower it. Then, suddenly, the light turned green. I jumped. That concludes the 8th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.